Wow, that's a good drawing. Oh, yeah.
There's something written on it.
You see on the top? Who's on which side? Tyranny and liberty together again. All right. Okay, let's go. We can talk a little bit. Let's finish up the boom bust cycle. Yeah. I'll give you a little more detail. I've decided if I'm going to do like I give you a list of a few terms and have you put it in for. But I'll tell you exactly what you mean. Let's look at it right now. Yeah.
If the weapon Christians to kill the Lord, would you rather not and then kill the Lord Liberty or kill the 5 strikers on the and if you don't do the levers in the
Seems to be a Faustian bargain. You go to lunch. So only evil will come out of this.
no.
You have a really bad choice.
Yeah, that's it's like what would you do?
Either get community.
But you really want to plus guys.
So
So what would you do?
what would I do? I would cheat, save them both.
How?
All right, here we go. So let's look at this. By the way, that is from 6th period on Friday. Isn't that beautiful? Are you kind of overwhelmed by this? So I'm gonna have a couple of these on here. Have a couple. I think I forgot something for your period. Did I mention GDP?
No.
Everyone put GDP on it. So anybody know what GDP stands for? Yeah, gross domestic product. And that is a very crude measurement of the size of the economy, size of the economy. So I think you get, in a boom, what's the GDP doing? Growing. In a bust, what's GDP doing? So you have to know this oversupply produced more, this part here for sure. And this is the recession. When it hits here, that's when the GDP starts to shrink. It doesn't mean it's going to go to a full-fledged panic, but the bubble always picks up and then it bursts, and that's the panic. And the thing is, it's really hard to get out. And you will have to have this here, this part of government action, demand, and then this is the engine that gets out of the depression. Some kind of government action to stimulate demand because nobody's buying anything, no one's producing. Demand, supply, unemployment drops, that means more demand. So we have inflationary, deflationary curve. And did we get to who came up with the boom bust? Marx. Did we say who has the advantage? Yeah, big. The bigger, the most wealthy, they have an advantage in a bust if they survive. Now, people with wealth are just as likely to overproduce or speculate as anybody else. But if they avoided the crash, they come out of this with wealth, even if they lost, they come out with wealth in the bust, they can accumulate wealth. And the big thing is what Marx said, it creates monopolies. That was Marx's victory. Busts lead to monopolies, and it's endemic in the boom bust cycle. It's endemic in capitalism. And we can see it it can be anywhere from 5 to 15 years goes another way. Now, I should add, when the New Deal hit during the Great Depression, one of the most important things about Roosevelt and the Democratic Party's New Deal is to put strict controls on banking to avoid this. And from 1933 to 2008, there was no financial news. Not one. So they seem to control. But the problem is financial panic in a boom, really big overheated boom, they get super rich. And so in the conservative revival beginning in the 80s, but then by 2000, they got rid of all those controls. And it took them less than 10 years to blow up the entire world economy. You got to admit, that's pretty impressive. That's in 10 years to blow it all up. So, where are we at? Okay, so Marx said this proves capitalism is inherently wrong. Now, if you were a fascist, you say this is perfectly fine. because it leads to monopolies and monopolies. Fascism is very much pro-monopoly, It's very social Darwinistic principles. To a fascist, this proves that it's good. The wealthy survive and get rich. For Marx, this proves capitalism is bad because it leads to monopolies. For a fascist, this proves that capitalism is good because it leads to monopolies, which of course gets rid of capitalism. So both of them, fascism and fascists and socialists don't like capitalism, but for vastly different reasons. But if you want capitalism to work in some way, here's the big deal. How do you avoid this? In fact, they have a term for this. This right here, they call it overheating. Everyone's like, we're buying too much, we're building too much, we're speculating too much. How do you stop the economy from overheating? So here, and the other key point is, I think it's pretty obvious, here, how do we get out of the bust? And this is the big debate for economics. And so this leads to two very important things that we'll see throughout the history of our next 130 years, up to this very moment. I had a watch I could look at. What is more important? Supply or demand? Supply means helping the supplier of goods, making things easier for capitalists, giving them more wealth, less controls. Wages, because it's supposed to produce more. Let them produce more. That's supply. Demand, that's people buying goods. And now we live in a modern consumer economy. That means people. That means higher wages, better working conditions, security if you're unemployed or retired. That is it. So which is most important? I'll ask again, supply or demand? Now let's get to the next step. Conservative or liberal economics. We hinted at a little bit of liberal economics. We'll come back to it. Done more conservative economics, because that's laissez-faire. Is supply more important for conservative or liberal economics? Who thinks conservative supply? Who thinks liberal? Who's that? Just tell us, because I don't want to guess now. Well, remember laissez-faire was conservative, and that's how this applies. So I get it, we're working on it. They actually call the official name for conservative economics is supply side. That is supply side. So liberal economics, sometimes you see it called Keynesian economics, is called demand side. So supply side, demand side. We'll get to this, get to what this means, but we are right now in a massive supply side experiment with President Trump. Unprecedented tax cuts and benefits for the top 1%, with the idea being that they will invest it. With it, whatever they please. But that's where we're at right now. We have been supply side economics for all your life, for the most part, except for maybe 2 years of the Biden administration. We haven't been really demand side since we've been conservative. This is a very conservative economic. And it's where we are. Next question. Okay, they can't completely control interest rates in the economy with the dollar and the payments. But what branch of the U.S. government, quasi separate from the executive branch, controls it? Did you see the hint? And I even put it up here, the Federal Reserve. So I've said this once before. I've said it twice before. Everybody write down Federal Reserve. You did not know that immediately. It's time to know stuff. My little know stuff. You're smart people. Don't be a smart person who doesn't know things, because then you're no longer smart. No, it's time to know stuff. And, well, this is basic stuff right here. This was created in 1913. They could raise interest rates, what's called the federal funds rate, the amount banks loan to each other, or lower interest rates. Everyone got that? So, if the economy is overheating, meaning there's overspeculation and overproduction, would the Federal Reserve, in this part right here, raise or lower interest rates? If the economy is overheating, they really call it like tapping the brakes. If you raise interest rates, it makes it harder to spend. If you raise interest rates, it's a little bit harder to borrow money to invest in your factory. So they raise the interest rate here, hoping to slow the economy down so it doesn't overheat into this. Has everyone got that? So, does it make sense why they would lower interest rates if you're down here? To make it easier to borrow money, so you could buy more. Make it easier to borrow money, so if you want to, when it starts coming out of the bus, if you want to expand your factory, it's easier to borrow money. So once again, if you did not know that, jot that down again. Raise interest rates to slow the economy down, lower it to speed it up. If you did not know that, it's time to know that, because this is literally happening right now. So what's happening right now? What's Federal Reserve doing? Are they raising or lowering? Okay, the last time they met, they kept it stable. They said we're going to kind of wait and see because prices are not acting like the way they should. In relatively bad economy. Before that, they lowered it 3 times. They meet every month. Federal Reserve Board meets every month. They lowered it 3. Why? Because they're really worried we're starting this. Really, really worried. And there are signs of a bubble. So they're really worried. But mostly because of tariffs, prices are still really high, so they're scared to forward too much. That's where we're at right now. So in 2022, when the country came out of the COVID, what happened with COVID? Actually, 2022, 2024, the economy was booming. The GDP was going up so fast, it was a piece of how well the economy was compared to the rest of the world. And what did they do to interest rates in 2022, 2023, 2024? They raised it every month for 2 years because they were worried about it. In the last 12 months, we've not had that worry. So that's the boom bust cycle. And that tells you it still works today. The only problem is, remember I told you about they think we might be here? We're never really sure. You can guess. But if the data is not very good, you know. All right. So, little economics, but it does directly apply to history. Let's get to unionism. Because remember during the Great Railroad Strike, workers shut down the entire Northwest. By the way, how did the Hayes administration put it down? What kind of soldiers did they use to stop the union? Yeah, they used black soldiers that put down white workers. They used racists. They also used rural against urban. That's actually a big thing that, for example, China or Russia does. So, unionism. We've mentioned this once before, remember collective bargaining. So workers alone have no real power, but together, because of scale, they can organize a contract for everybody called collective bargaining. Here's a poster from the International Workers of the World. We'll get to them a little bit later, but individual workers together, a big fist. And that was always a symbol, you know, fist. Unity. So they negotiate a contract together. And the union I'm in, the Helena Education Association, we are on our last year of our contract. So they're going to start negotiating the contract this year for the next 2 or 3 years. We got our last contract, a raise, a bigger raise this year, next year, and what else? Retirement incentives and things like that. So, craft or trade unions. These are skilled workers, not just skilled in folks, because people have all kinds of skills. But these are a skill that's in demand, so they pay more. Usually where there's like a certificate. Something that machines have not replaced them yet. For example, a cooper who makes barrels couldn't be done by machine yet. So that was still a very important skill. A mason, a pipe fitter, incredibly important. Or engineer for a train. But for example, a peddler, their union used to be really popular. Peddler made steel. But after the Bessemer process and open hearth, they're gone. They went from skilled to unskilled. So these are people who are paid based upon their skill and the training they have. When I first started teaching, the Hellman Education Association, which I'm a member of, was a craft union. Only teachers. Next, industrial unions. Industrial all workers. Now, when I mean all workers, doesn't mean that like they'll say skilled and unskilled. Well, they're skilled. They just don't have a skill that is necessary demand at that moment. And so that's all workers, meaning the vast majority of workers are in industrial union. So I mentioned my union. My union about 12 years ago opened up. We had to vote on it, but opened up from a relatively exclusionary skilled union where people read, or teachers, professional that occupation, and it opened up to other workers in the district, like the custodians and paraprofessionals who are on the school, the nuts and bolts of the school. And it was actually pretty controversial, but there were some teachers who were opposed to allowing them in our union. But they are now in our union, and it is now a much bigger industrial union. So, and the big argument for working conditions. 2,000 railroad workers were dying. That's how dangerous it was by the 1800s. Miners, we don't even know how many miners. Railroads, the big thing about railroads, there are lots of reasons why. They're incredibly complex to fix a steam engine. And so just the process of fixing them would be dangerous with the engine involved. But the big one were the breakers, Every railway car had to be stopped up. This would be all the way well to the 20th century, individually. You had to have someone on top of it turn a crank. And the crank would press a pad against the wheel and stop it. The disc brake is called. So they couldn't just push a button for the engineer and go down the entire train and stop it. But a train, every car had to brake because if just the engine broke, it would derail. And so you had to have guys riding, so always a man, riding on each boxcar. And they'd have to be outside the boxcar because you have to look up and see when to stop. And so a train would go by and there'd be a guy huddled, and there'd be a ladder off the side of the boxcar in between the cars holding on. They have to peek their head up to look for a light from the engineer if they're going to stop. So think how dangerous that is. Can you imagine going across North Dakota, that people riding on the train, or for that matter, bridges and abundance. So dangerous, and then fell off all the time. That's just a good example of how that happens. Now, by 1890, they could go to air brakes, but it was actually cheaper to keep hiring low-wage workers, especially immigrants, to do that. Terrifying job. So, the other one though is more basic. Capitalism is very authoritarian, and do you still have democracy in the workplace? Capitalism, it makes sense they're authoritarian. If somebody takes the risk and starts a factory, they want to organize it the way they want. They took the risk, and they want to make sure everyone's working together. But capitalism has a very authoritarian streak where a basic question has to be asked. Do you still have rights once you enter the workplace? Or does your constitutional rights that came from the 14th Amendment still exist when you enter the workplace? And that is a major question. And it's everything as basic as what you say or do while you're working, but also when you're not working anymore. Can you be fired for what you say outside of your job? Absolutely. You can be fired. People are fired all the time for what they say outside the workplace. in some states. Montana actually has some of the strongest labor laws. But once, if you leave the state, go to any of our neighbors, they can go look at your social media and they don't like it anymore. So this democracy exists in the workplace. So, but the other big issue was child labor. Here are kids working in textile mills, breaker boys in factories, or cotton. 20% of all people under the age of 15 were 20% of children were working full shifts. Working 10 to 15 hours a day by 1890. 20% of children. And what does that do to wages? Lowers wages. Because children, they pay, they're considered a lower status of worker. So they are going to pay them lower and increases the pool of workers. Therefore, you have adult men and women competing with, and mostly men, competing with children. And that lowers wages. Same reason why Jim Crow lowered wages. And the same reason why women being treated as second class or as inferior lowers wages. Because you have this economic underclass, lower pay. But there's something else. You have people, men and women working back-breaking jobs. And regardless if they're like happy we got the job, they know you're a miner. You're not gonna live much longer after you can't work, or you might die right there in the mine. We just mentioned 2,000 railroad workers dying in Vermont. That's the life you're gonna have with children. What hope do these boys have? 10 years old being breaker boys. What hope do they have in the future? I guess maybe they won't be breaker boys and they're not mangled to death. They fall into the huge and crushed. Still living, but what are their options? What hope do they have in the future? They want their children to have a better life. That's part of the reason why labor unions would be such a big fighter for public education. That'd be one of the reasons. To increase opportunities, which also increases wages. So, there are two labor unions we have to know. The first one is the Knights of Labor, 1869. It started then, but actually gained strength after the panic when Terence Powderly took over. Powderly was an able organizer. He had some flaws, but he had a really cool mustache. You got to admit, that's a mustache. And they build themselves as one big union. It's an industrial union with all, and I mean all workers in it. And it went across different companies. They wanted not just like one factory have a union, another union, all workers. Yeah. Powderly. Yeah. 1869. But they really became strong after the panic. And their anti-wage system. They wanted some kind of cooperative system. It's unclear what that meant, but something where the workers have more control over production, the workplace. Basically, like collective bargaining on a grand scale. But they wanted better working conditions and an 8-hour workday. This is one of the big campaigns by the Knights of Labor. If you're working for somebody else, 8 hours a day so you can have sleep and a life outside of work. Because you're on the wage system here. What does an 8-hour workday do for wages? Lower than dramatic. So think about once you have electricity. You can run a factory 24 hours a day. That could be 2 12-hour shifts. But if it's an 8-hour workday, how many shifts? And that means a third more workers in demand. That means higher wages. Now, they're proposing this in 1880. It would not happen in the United States until part of the New Deal in 1938. By the way, how do they enforce the 8-hour working day? Yes. Stop. Why not? Yeah, overtime, work over 8 hours, you get time. That's all it is. On jobs that qualify. They're expanding the number of jobs that don't qualify. Wait, we're not done. We are not done. Oh, we can put together a notebook back out. How did the bell ring now? It's a minute early. I want one more thing to finish.
But
This is the last two things on this. It'll be fine, yeah. Probably Friday and Thursday if I get that. I'll give you a review this.
okay, right.
Yeah. They're, you know, just, just, rule by authority, rule by decree.
So like that's.
Like most dictatorships are, I'm gonna give what to you. Totalitarian, they literally want to control all elements. Well, you know. They're both can be really bad, but there are a lot of people who like authoritarian states, so. Huh? People like authority. There's a lot of people who like the idea of a strong man in charge.